Her hands trembled as she picked up the weapon, fingers struggling to hold the cold steel steady. Under the harsh Arizona morning sun, every shake, every flicker of vulnerability was exposed, and the young recruits noticed. 23 pairs of eyes followed her movements with quiet scrutiny, some with confusion, others with quiet contempt. At the firing range at Camp Meridian, Sergeant Elena Cross squared her shoulders and tried to focus her aim, willing the tremor to stop. "Look at those shaking hands," Private Ethan Ward said with a smirk, loud enough for his phone mic to pick it up. "Maybe they should issue her training wheels with that sidearm." His crude laughter echoed through the dry expanse, soon joined by a few stifled chuckles. To them, she was just an older woman, one who didn't belong here, fumbling with tools meant for younger hands. But when General Marcus Hale reviewed the footage later that evening, the lines on his weathered face went noticeably pale, not from surprise, but from something deeper, recognition and fear, because he knew exactly what those trembling hands were capable of. He knew the real story behind every tremor, every movement misjudged by rookies as weakness or age. Those weren't signs of fragility. They were echoes of something earned in silence, paid for in places no one dared speak of. And when her name finally surfaced, even the hardest soldiers would be forced to take a knee. As for Ethan Ward's smug little viral moment, it would go down as the single worst miscalculation of his career. Because stories like this aren't just about redemption. They remind us why we serve. To honor the quiet warriors, the ones whose courage goes unnoticed in a world too distracted to look closely. If you believe in our mission to uncover and honor the hidden stories of human resilience, consider clicking the thank you button below. Every bit of support, no matter how small, helps us bring more of these quiet truths to light, where ordinary individuals rise to moments that demand extraordinary strength. Now let's return to that blistering morning on the Camp Meridian firing range, where what looked like fragility was about to become a revelation, a truth that would forever change. How those young recruits understood the word strength. Beyond the rusted chain-link fences of Camp Meridian, the Arizona desert sprawled in all directions, icy landscape as brutal as it was beautiful. It was here that soldiers were stripped down to their core, trained not in comfort, but in the raw heat and silence of something that felt close to war. This wasn't the polished prestige of West Point. It wasn't the history-wrapped legacy of Fort Benning. This was a working base, real ground, real sweat, and real lessons. Where the battlefield didn't start with enemy fire. It started with what you saw in the person next to you. Sergeant Elena Cross had arrived at Camp Meridian just 3 weeks prior, transferred under circumstances that remained deliberately vague. Only the base commander and a handful of officers with top-tier clearance had seen the real file. The paperwork that accompanied her orders bore a cold, impersonal label. Medical reassignment, classified. No further explanation. Just enough to quiet questions. And more than enough to stir silent speculation. At 45, she stood in stark contrast to the fresh-faced recruits around her, like a fire-scarred oak among green saplings, rooted deeper, shaped by storms they hadn't yet faced. Silver had begun to streak through her tightly bound black hair, secured with regulation-perfect precision. Her olive skin bore the subtle weathering of long deployments, years, spent beneath unrelenting suns in places where shadows weren't shade. They were survival. But what truly marked her wasn't appearance, it was movement. A near imperceptible hitch in her step. The slight favoring of her right leg. Not weakness, but memory. A wound that hadn't quite healed, and never quite stopped speaking. When she thought no one was watching, Elena Cross's hands would sometimes tremble, just enough to suggest lingering nerve damage. Or something darker. Whatever had happened to her before she arrived at Camp Meridian had become a constant undercurrent of speculation. Among the trainees, some whispered she was recovering from a combat wound, pointing out how she occasionally hesitated before straightening her left arm. Others claimed she was simply past her prime, that her transfer to a training facility was the military's polite way of offering her a soft landing, a dignified path to retirement. Private Ethan Ward, 22 and barely seasoned, quickly became the unofficial mouthpiece of those doubts. Tall, lean, and shaped by the comfort of the affluent Texas suburbs, Ethan radiated the kind of cocky energy that made his words stick. Soon his assumptions weren't just his own, they became the narrative repeated by others. But what made Ethan truly dangerous wasn't his arrogance. It was his obsession with attention. His TikTok account brimmed with clips, He called highlights of military life, teetering on the edge between humor and outright disrespect. And with a growing following of curious civilians, hungry for glimpses inside military culture, Ethan's camera had just found its next story. A story he couldn't possibly understand. He had built a sizable following civilian viewers, captivated by curated glimpses into military life. They didn't know what service really meant, but they were hungry for it anyway. Ethan Ward knew how to feed that hunger, with his charm, his timing, and a phone always recording. He had the dangerous ability to turn fleeting struggles into viral mockery. "Watch this," he said casually, holding his phone steady as he filmed Elena Cross struggling with weapon maintenance during the second week of training. The camera caught everything, her hands shaking as she tried to disassemble her service pistol, the fine tremors disrupting movements that once came second nature. Metal parts clinked softly onto the cleaning mat, separated, but not in the clean sequence expected of military precision. "This is what happens," Ethan muttered for the recording, "when the military lowers its standards just to hit a quota." To him, the scattered gun components were evidence of incompetence. What he didn't realize, what none of them grasped, was that Elena's struggle had nothing to do with knowledge, or training, or lack of discipline. Her technique was perfect. Her understanding of the weapon was deeper than anyone on that range. But her body simply wouldn't obey. Maybe she should try a different career, one of Ethan's buddies said, loud enough for Elena to hear. Something that doesn't require steady hands, like knitting or baking cookies. The laughter that followed was sharp and effortless, slicing through the air with a cruelty that came dressed as humor. But Elena Cross didn't flinch. She didn't defend herself. She didn't offer an excuse. She didn't ask for understanding. She just kept going, one slow, deliberate movement at a time, not fighting the tremor, but working within it, not struggling to meet their expectations, but honoring the limits she had already made peace with. And if anyone had been truly paying attention, they might have recognized that silence for what it was, a warning. At Camp Meridian, the same quiet discipline that defined Elena Cross on the range was reflected in her barracks room, where other soldiers decorated their spaces with family photos, mementos from past deployments, or bits of personal comfort. Elena's room was almost monastic in its simplicity. Spartan, still, more like a place of silent prayer than a place of rest. There was only one personal item, a photograph propped neatly on the side table beside her bed. 26 faces, all in uniform, all young, all wearing that confident look soldiers have when they still believe they're invincible. It wasn't labeled, but the photo clearly belonged to a specific unit. The kind forged not by routine but by survival. A team born of long, dangerous deployment in places that didn't make headlines. But there was something haunting about that photo. Something final, as if the moment it captured would never exist again. Next to the photograph sat a pair of dog tags, worn, aged, and clearly not from her current assignment. The metal had dulled in places, edges smoothed from years of being handled. The engraving was barely legible now, rubbed thin by time and memory. But the way Elena Cross would reach for them when she was alone, softly, almost like a ritual, made one thing clear. They weren't just tags. They were a tether. To something. To someone. As training drills continued, the contrast between her calm, seasoned demeanor and her visible physical limitations only became more pronounced. When instructors demonstrated combat maneuvers, Elena didn't watch like a student. She studied them like someone already fluent in the language, watching not for what was taught, but for what wasn't. And when she did ask questions, they carried a depth that didn't belong in a beginner's mouth. There was precision in her voice, like someone sharpening a blade she already knew how to wield. "How did you know to calculate crosswind at that distance?" Instructor Walsh asked during a long-range shooting lesson, pausing after her quiet correction. Had revealed a wind variable he hadn't accounted for. There was more than curiosity in his voice. There was surprise, and maybe a little unease, because that level of detail, that kind of ballistic awareness came from elite training, and there was nothing in Elena's file to suggest she'd ever been part of such a unit. Previous deployment, she said simply. No elaboration. No softness. Just a wall of finality in her tone that shut the door on follow-up questions. But her answer didn't resolve anything. If anything, it deepened the uncertainty surrounding her. Because the kind of deployments that taught long-range wind calculations didn't end with reassignment to a training base. At least, not without a very good reason. Meanwhile, Ethan Ward's campaign of mockery was intensifying, fueled not just by arrogance, but by frustration. Elena Cross's silence had become a wall he couldn't climb. He had expected pushback, anger, embarrassment, maybe even a breakdown he could turn into another viral moment. But instead, he was met with unwavering restraint. A calm, measured quiet that only deepened his obsession. "I'm thinking of starting a new series." He smirked into his phone between training drills. A little reality check on what happens when the military prioritizes inclusion over standards. She's the poster child, proof that good intentions can still ruin a uniform. His phone captured it all. Every tremor in Elena's hands. Every stumble that interrupted her otherwise precise technique. Every moment she struggled to complete tasks the others sailed through. To his followers, it was raw content. To Ethan, it was ammunition. Clip by clip, he was assembling something. Not just a narrative, but a weapon. A slow, deliberate character assassination wrapped in satire, designed to wound without ever drawing blood. And he had no idea what he was waking. In the background, Ethan Ward's quiet war was gaining momentum. What began as jabs and snide remarks had turned into something darker. A calculated campaign fed by his frustration at Elena Cross's silence. He wanted a reaction. Rage, tears, even a misstep that could justify his cruelty. Anything that would amuse the growing horde watching from behind their screens. But Elena gave him nothing. She absorbed his cruelty the same way she handled everything else, with a steady professional calm that refused to crack. "I might launch a new video series," he muttered during a break, grinning into his camera phone. "Gonna show what happens when the military lowers its standards to look inclusive. She's Exhibit A, textbook case of good intentions gone wrong." And then he filmed. Every time Elena's hands trembled under pressure. Every slip, every slow response, every obstacle she tackled with quiet determination. He captured it all. To him, it wasn't just footage. It was ammunition. Clip by clip, he was stockpiling a narrative. A slow-burning takedown masked as content. A digital firing squad aimed at one woman, who had refused to break the way he needed her to. What he didn't see was that the silence he mocked was not weakness, it was warning. What Ethan Ward's camera never caught, what it couldn't catch, was the sharpness behind Elena Cross's quiet eyes. It was a calculating kind of intelligence, the kind that only surfaced when no one was watching. She studied every challenge with a battlefield-hardened mind. Her decisions swift and precise, not born of theory but of real-world experience, the kind earned under fire. Her movements carried subtle precision, minute shifts in balance, timing, posture. What looked like hesitation to the untrained eye was, in truth, adaptation. Refinement shaped by necessity, not weakness. Only someone deeply trained would see the truth. This wasn't clumsiness. This was control. Deliberate, methodical, measured. Then came the obstacle course. A brutal, full-gear simulation designed to mirror the chaos of combat. Ethan saw it as the perfect opportunity to break her publicly. "I've got a good feeling about this one." He smirked to his camera as Elena took her place at the start line. "Let's see what happens when shaky hands meet real pressure. Might finally be time to shut this whole inclusion charade down." The course spanned 200 yards of relentless terrain, rope climbs that burned shoulders raw, balance beams above pits that punished even the smallest misstep, tight crawl zones that crushed breath from lungs, and live fire stations where calm, control, and deadly accuracy had to unite. All while a clock ticked down like a fuse. Elena Cross ignored every textbook tactic. Instead of working her way from the closest target outward, she lifted her rifle straight toward the 300-yard mark. The hardest shot on the line, her hands still trembled. The same tremble that had haunted every drill, every exercise. Ethan Ward's camera caught it, immediately, zooming in on her quivering fingers like a predator closing in. "She's leading with the long shot," he muttered into his mic. Half amused, half already triumphant. "She can't even hold steady? This'll be a disaster." The rifle cracked. One sharp report that cut through the desert wind like a whip. The butt kicked into her shoulder, but she didn't flinch. Then, silence. Only the dry rustle of wind through the abandoned steel skeletons of the range. A pause. Then the range officer's voice came across the speaker, sharp and mechanical. "Center mass." The words floated in the dry heat like smoke. Impossible, undeniable. Ethan's commentary stopped mid-sentence. His brow furrowed. The disbelief on his face said more than words ever could. Around her, shooters lowered their weapons. No one moved. All eyes locked on Elena, who was already shifting her stance. Methodical, focused, ignoring the stares as she lined up her next target. Must have been a lucky shot, someone murmured, but even as the words escaped, they fell flat. It wasn't luck. Not in the way Elena Cross moved, measured, unshaken. Not in how she chambered the next round with that same deliberate rhythm. And certainly not in her face, calm, focused, as if everything was going exactly as she expected. The second shot cracked through the desert air and landed dead center again. Then the third. Then the fourth. Each bullet was released from hands that visibly trembled. Hands that had drawn mockery, doubt, and silence from instructors who thought they'd seen it all. And yet, the rounds hit like they'd been fired from a stabilized rig. Straight from a sniper school demo. Textbook perfection. By the time she approached the final target, a small crowd had gathered at the edge of the range. Quiet now, watching with a kind of stunned reverence. Even Ethan Ward's camera stayed trained on her. But the narration, once smug, had gone silent. The footage he meant to use to discredit, Elena was now capturing something that upended every assumption he'd made. Those trembling hands, once ridiculed as a liability, were outperforming steady ones under pressure. How is this possible? One instructor whispered to another. We teach that stability is everything. That level of tremor should make precision impossible. But Elena wasn't just compensating. She was adapting. Every shot was a defiance of physics as they understood it. An evolution of technique that didn't eliminate weakness, but folded it into strength. As if the tremor had become a rhythm, hers alone, and she had trained it into something no manual could teach. The silence after her final shot wasn't the awkward hush of failure. It was something far heavier. It was the stunned, collective pause that descends after witnessing something that doesn't fit into the rules. Everyone thought they understood. Even Colt's most loyal followers, those who'd laughed and jeered, just minutes earlier, had fallen completely still. The soundbite he'd hoped to spin into humiliation now floated uselessly in the dry desert air. All targets eliminated! The range officer's voice crackled through the speaker. Calm, but carrying that quiet edge of respect reserved for something exceptional. Top-tier marksmanship under sustained stress. Rhea Cross lowered, her rifle with the same unwavering discipline that had marked every movement. She dropped the magazine, cleared the chamber, and cycled the bolt with the kind of muscle memory that ignored the tremor still, visibly in her hands. She didn't acknowledge the whispers, didn't look for praise. There was no nod, no smile. Just silence. Steady silence. She slung the rifle over her shoulder and walked, back toward the gear return as if nothing had happened. Behind her, the recruits remained frozen, no longer judging, no longer mocking, just watching. Each of them now questioning the one thing they thought. Boot camp had taught them that weakness can't win, because what they had just seen proved it could. The woman they had written off as unfit, fragile, broken, better off reassigned, had just done something most of them couldn't replicate on their best day, not even with steadier hands or cleaner records. Colt Brennan stood frozen, his phone still pointed in her direction. But now the footage wasn't what he'd planned. It wasn't humiliation. It wasn't a stumble. It was precision. It was control. And worst of all, it was undeniable. The video that was supposed to expose Reina Castellanos as a liability had turned into a quiet monument to his own blind arrogance. For the first time since he'd started his smear campaign, Colt was forced to consider a possibility that had never made it into any of his clips. That he hadn't understood her at all. But the thought didn't last. That same reflex, the one that made him spin narratives and feed his carefully curated version of the truth, snapped back into place like muscle memory. He turned slightly, keeping the camera angled just enough to catch his expression. One good day doesn't erase weeks of failure, he said, forcing his voice into calm confidence as he ended the recording. Even luck gets a shot sometimes. The question is, can she perform when lives are actually on the line? He told the story he wanted, even as the truth had just shattered it in front of everyone. His words even managed to calm the newly enlisted young soldiers, many of whom were reluctant to abandon their previous judgments. Watching someone excel, someone they had already labeled as weak and unfit, was stirring an uncomfortable contradiction in their minds. And the simplest way to ease that tension was to downplay her achievement, rather than confront the possibility that they had been wrong. Maybe she went through some elite training program we don't know about, one of them muttered. Doesn't mean she belongs in active duty. Shooting's just one part of the job. These rationalizations gave them a safe way out. They didn't have to reevaluate their standards or question who truly deserves to wear the uniform. Because to admit that Elena might be far more capable than they'd believed, that would force them to reconsider their own assumptions, their biases, and their very definition of competence. And that was a reflection they weren't ready to face. What none of them realized, however, was that their quiet justifications weren't so quiet after all. Someone else had heard them. Someone who recognized exactly what Elena's performance revealed and what it meant. General Marcus Hale, observing the training range from his office, window through a pair of high-powered binoculars, had turned visibly pale, because General Hale knew, in the entire military system, there was only one person capable of that level of precision, while still carrying the kind of neurological damage that could cause a tremor like hers. And that person was standing right in front of them. He knew every detail, because it had been his signature on the top-secret reports. The ones stamped with the highest level of clearance, the ones that chronicled her capture behind enemy lines, the brutal interrogations, the deliberate mutilation of her hands. The enemy hadn't just wanted to break her, they wanted to erase what made her lethal. They knew exactly who she was and what she could do. The same woman now being quietly dismissed by half-trained recruits as unfit was, in fact, the most feared sniper their armed forces had ever produced. Before her capture, her precision had already become the stuff of legend, uncanny accuracy, instinctive calculations, impossible shots under impossible conditions. But what chilled General Blackstone to the bone was the realization that she hadn't lost that edge. Somehow, against all odds, it had sharpened. That tremor in her hands? It wasn't a flaw. It was a scar. The visible consequence of targeted nerve damage, inflicted by an enemy terrified of what she represented. An enemy that had tried and failed to silence her trigger finger forever. What those recruits mistook for the breakdown of military standards was something far more unsettling. The silent return of a ghost. A weapon forged in war, buried by bureaucracy, now walking again among the ranks like nothing had happened. And yet, the most remarkable part wasn't her accuracy. It was her choice. General Blackstone had seen the request cross his desk. Not a demand. Not a plea. A simple, formal application, assignment to a new training unit, stripped of history without favor or acknowledgement. She had asked for this. She had chosen to return, not as a hero or a legend, but as a soldier, trying to earn her place again, starting from the bottom. No medals, no speeches, just a quiet, personal war against everything her enemies had tried to take from her. She wasn't here to be seen. She was here to prove they hadn't finished her. The general's expression hardened as he watched Colt Brennan hit upload. The video edited for mockery showed Raina's hands trembling ever so slightly as she reloaded, then cut to a close-up of her target, riddled with clean clustered shots. Colt's caption oozed sarcasm. When shaky hands passed the test. Standards or sympathy? What Colt didn't know was that his thirst for online fame had just crossed a line. And this time the consequences wouldn't be digital. They would be institutional. Behind closed doors, there were individuals who had spent years keeping Reina, Castellanos' identity buried for her protection and for national security. But now they had decided silence had gone on long enough. A truth was stirring, one that wouldn't just upend the whispers around Camp Meridian, but would force the entire military establishment to re-examine what sacrifice really looks like and how easily people forget the price. Others have paid to give them the luxury of their cynicism, because the truth about Reina Castellanos wasn't just inconvenient, it was classified. And Colt Brennan, who had built his following by tearing down what he didn't understand, was about to discover that some warriors fight battles long after the medals stop, and some reputations, once restored, burn brighter than any smear campaign. 3 days later, Colt's video hit 200,000 views. The title read, "When Military Standards Fall, Shaking Hands at the Range." What started as cheap ridicule was quickly spiraling into something else. Debates flooded the comment section, arguments over policy, disability, standards, and courage. But something else was happening too. The video had made its way to offices far beyond. Camp Meridian, places where the names, dates, and missions behind those trembling hands were still sealed in vaults. And someone, somewhere, had just decided to unseal a few. Most viewers saw only what they wanted to see, Reina's trembling hands. To them, that one detail confirmed everything. Colt Brennan had implied that standards were slipping, that the military was going soft. Very few examined the actual shooting. Fewer still understood what they were looking at. Those who did dismissed it as lucky aim or video manipulation. Colt's version of the story, that Reyna was a symbol of decay, was easier to swallow than the truth, that she had outperformed everyone on that range using nothing but precision, muscle memory, and a mastery of technique that couldn't be faked. But buried among the wave of casual judgment was a single viewer, who noticed something different. Colonel Sarah Hurst, stationed at the Pentagon, and one of the few people authorized to review flagged content tied to covert personnel profil. Her eyes froze on the screen the moment Reyna adjusted her stance. The angle, the breathing rhythm, the fractional delay between trigger pull and target impact. She knew that sequence. It had a name. She opened a secure line to General Blackstone. Her voice was calm, but her words were urgent. Harrison, we've got a situation. Someone just uploaded footage of Ghost 13. That video's exploding online. If anyone with clearance sees what I just saw, it's game over. Blackstone went still. Ghost 13 wasn't a person. She was a protocol. An off-books operative known only by a handful of people across the entire defense network. A legend with no face. A sniper whose operations were so classified, even top-ranking officials had access only to code names and aftermath summaries. Her true identity had been buried to protect the integrity of missions, still ongoing across hostile zones. To reveal her now could unravel years of alliances, expose tactical patterns, and put entire cells at risk. And yet there she was. Not in some distant war zone, but in an online clip, misunderstood, underestimated, and now possibly exposed. She specifically requested anonymity, General Marcus Hale said, his voice weighed down by choices that could no longer be reversed. After what she endured during captivity, all she wanted was to serve, quietly, without a name, without the baggage of legend. But now, with that video making its rounds, her quiet was slipping through the cracks. The conversation that followed wasn't about discipline. It was about damage control. Encrypted calls bounced between secure lines. Security assessments were initiated. Contingency plans revised. Threat vectors analyzed. All because Ethan Ward, chasing likes and digital relevance, had unwittingly triggered a national security crisis. What he'd seen as a viral moment was now a flashing red flag at the highest levels of command. Meanwhile, at Camp Meridian, Elena Cross moved through her daily routine with the same steady composure she'd maintained since arrival. The whispers in the barracks, the eyes that followed, the phones that tilted up just enough to capture her. None of it showed on her face. But for those who truly watched her, not just looked, something had shifted. She had begun spending more hours at the armory, more requests for range time. Officially, it was logged as routine marksmanship certification. Unofficially, she was sending a message. Session after session, round after round, her trembling hands still struck with impossible precision. Her bullets grouped in impossibly tight clusters, over and over again. She's not practicing, Instructor Walsh murmured to a fellow NCO as they observed from behind the glass. She's proving something. And it's not to us. He was right. Elena knew her time at Meridian was on borrowed hours. She'd felt the breach the moment Ethan's video exploded online. Her anonymity, painstakingly protected for years, was unraveling. It was no longer if her identity would surface. It was when and under whose control. That question was answered early Thursday morning. General Marcus Hale received a classified directive from the Pentagon. The matter was now out of his hands. The Department of Defense had authorized a formal response. Elena Cross's identity would be revealed, carefully, on military terms, on their timeline, and under the guise of honoring unrecognized service, not exposing her to danger. Later that day, the entire training company was summoned to the main hall. General Hale stood at the front, flanked by a sealed display case and a draped screen. His tone was deliberate, his presence unmistakably solemn. Today's presentation, he began, is about excellence, about those who serve in silence, about warriors who carry burdens they can never speak of. Today, we honor one of those warriors. The room went still. Some recruits straightened with anticipation. Others glanced toward Elena, but she kept her gaze fixed ahead, her expression unreadable. No one could have guessed what would follow, and none would forget what came next. The recruits had assembled in the main briefing hall, many of them with phones in hand, eager to record whatever was coming. At the front row, Ethan Ward had already begun filming, expecting yet another opportunity to critique the chain of command. His expression was confident, too confident, despite the quiet discomfort growing among several recruits who had begun to suspect there was more to Elena Cross than they initially thought. General Marcus Hale entered without ceremony. His voice, when it came, had the unmistakable gravity of a man who'd seen too much war to waste words on theatrics. For the past month, he began, you've all trained alongside someone whose full record, by necessity, has been classified. What you've witnessed, what some of you have misunderstood, cannot be explained without context, and the time for context has come. The air in the hall shifted. The room fell silent. Phones slowly lowered, fingers paused mid-record. Everyone could feel it. This wasn't a routine address. This was something else. 3 years ago, General Hale continued, Staff Sergeant Elena Cross volunteered for an op that military planners had quietly labeled a statistical impossibility. The mission, eliminate a Tier 1 terrorist who had taken civilian hostages inside a compound shielded by non-combatants. Air support was off the table. So was entry by ground teams. His words hung in the air like dust in a shaft of sunlight. Recruits glanced toward Elena, who stood at attention, her posture unreadable, her face a mask of stillness. The only viable solution, the general went on, was a precision shot, 800 yards, through a 6-inch window, in 40-mile-an-hour crosswinds. One bullet. No second chances. The hostages' lives depended on millimeter accuracy. No one spoke. No one moved. Ethan's camera was still in his hands, forgotten. The bravado had drained from his face. He stared ahead, processing what he was hearing. Staff Sergeant Cross made that shot. The target was eliminated. All 37 hostages survived, but during exfiltration the team came under fire. She stayed behind to cover the others, and was captured. There was a shift in the general's tone, just enough to suggest this part still haunted him. The enemy knew exactly who they had taken. They understood what her capture meant, not just tactically but symbolically. For 7 months, she endured what most wouldn't survive a week of. Yet she gave up nothing. The room had gone dead quiet. The kind of silence that can only come from respect mixed with regret. Eventually we got her out. But due to operational secrecy, her name was buried beneath layers of denial. And that secrecy extended here, to this program, this base, and to all of you. Until now, the general let the silence settle again. No one dared to look at Elena, not out of pity, out of something much heavier. Respect. So when you ask who Elena Cross really is, what she's done, and why she's here, I suggest you start by asking yourself a harder question. What does it mean that someone like her walks among you
and says nothing?
He nodded once, then turned and exited, leaving a stunned room behind. Ethan Ward sat frozen, his recording unfinished. The narrative he'd been pushing about weakness, about lowered standards, had just been obliterated in under 5 minutes. And the woman he had mocked for weeks? She hadn't even blinked. Every soldier in the hall now understood. They were hearing information that would normally never leave a secure facility. For 23 months, General Hale said, his voice steel-edged, Staff Sergeant Elena Cross endured systematic torture intended to destroy not her mind, but her hands. Electrical shocks, targeted nerve damage, blunt trauma delivered with surgical precision, all of it designed to eliminate her ability to do the one thing the enemy feared most, take the shot. Some of the recruits instinctively looked at their own hands, flexing their fingers as if trying to comprehend what it would mean to lose control of them by design. The tremor they had laughed at suddenly changed shape in their minds. It was no longer a sign of fragility. It was evidence, a visible remnant of trauma, of survival. When she escaped, and yes, she escaped, though the details of how remain classified, she returned with permanent nerve damage that affects fine motor control. Hale continued, the tremor you've seen is not a limitation she developed. It is a scar, a neurological reminder of what was done to her. His words landed like hammers. What her captors didn't expect was that Elena Cross would spend every day of those 23 months retraining her hands, teaching herself to shoot through the damage, to work with the tremor instead of fighting it. They tried to take her greatest strength. Instead, she created a new one. A long silence followed. It wasn't awkward, it was reverent. Soldiers were being forced to confront the weight of their own assumptions. The woman they had mocked had done more than survive torture. She had evolved through it. You know her call sign as Ghost 13, General Hale said, now fully facing the assembled recruits. A sniper with 347 confirmed eliminations. 0 failed missions. A service record so classified most of you will never see more than redacted fragments. He paused again, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Ethan Ward. She didn't come here to coast into retirement. She didn't come here for accolades. She requested this assignment specifically because she wanted to prove she could still serve, on her own terms, without the weight of her legend, without your pity, without your approval. Ward's face had gone as pale as the walls behind him. The phone in his hand trembled, slightly before slipping from his grip, and clattering to the floor, the sound echoing in the charged silence. He had built his online presence around derision and judgment, and every word, every post, had been aimed at a woman whose sacrifice he could never hope to understand. The marksmanship demonstration you witnessed wasn't luck, Hale concluded. It was a glimpse, a fraction of what she's capable of, a reminder that strength takes many forms and judgment should be reserved for those who've earned the right to pass it. When the general dismissed the company, no one moved. They remained seated, stunned, each person internally reviewing their behavior, their assumptions, their words. Elena Cross stood at attention until formally dismissed. Then she turned and walked toward the exit with her usual deliberate pace. But now that pace meant something very different. It wasn't the motion of someone carrying limitations. It was the measured stride of someone who had learned, through unimaginable pain, that every movement mattered. Every step had purpose and every breath was earned. The tremor in her hands had become more than a neurological artifact. It was a symbol of survival. Within hours, Ethan Ward's social media presence collapsed. The context surrounding his videos detonated online, with comment sections flooded by active duty, military and veterans who recognized what they were seeing. The ridicule he'd built his audience on now felt cruel, hollow, and reprehensible. His follower count didn't just decline, it imploded. But the real damage wasn't digital. It was internal. He had spent weeks attacking a soldier whose strength, discipline, and sacrifice made his own contribution seem insignificant by comparison. And now he knew it. 6 months later, Elena Cross had become the most requested instructor at Camp Meridian. Troops transferred from other bases specifically to train under Ghost 13, not to learn just how to shoot, but to understand what resilience looked like in the flesh. She never spoke about captivity, never lectured, never told war stories. Instead, she taught by presence, by discipline, by example, by stillness. The tremor in her hands no longer provoked whispers or mockery. It inspired respect, because it was no longer seen as weakness. It was a reminder of what true strength looks like when pushed to the absolute edge and beyond. In a world obsessed with visibility, applause, and image, Elena Cross remained a quiet symbol of everything the uniform was supposed to represent, and for the first time, those around her finally saw it.